The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Carlos's face, only 12 years old, turned with the force of the blow as his backpack fell to the dirty tile floor. Coins rolled everywhere. "Learn to walk straight, kid," shouted Brandon Hayes, 16, who stood 6 feet tall. His gold football ring left a red mark on the child's cheek. Fat Tony's Burger was where students stopped after school. Cheap, noisy, with little supervision. Brandon had ruled that territory for 2 years, charging protection money from younger kids and always finding reasons to humiliate those he considered inferior. Carlos slowly got up, touching his bruised face. His dark eyes showed no fear, something that should have alerted Brandon. "Sorry," Carlos muttered, gathering his scattered coins, snack money his grandmother had given him that morning. "Sorry doesn't pay for my sneakers you stepped on," Brandon kicked the coins away. "You know how much these cost? More than your whole house." The teenagers laughed. Phones came out. What none of them noticed was Carlos discreetly turning on his phone recorder and sliding it under a nearby table. The employee behind the counter, Rosa, hesitated. Brandon was the son of an important local businessman. Carlos was just another poor kid. She lowered her eyes and pretended not to see. "My dad always says people like you need to learn respect," Brandon continued, pushing Carlos against the wall. "Maybe a harsher lesson will teach you manners." Carlos did something unexpected. Instead of crying, he looked Brandon straight in the eye with disturbing calm. "My dad also teaches me about respect and consequences." Brandon laughed. "Your father? What father? I bet you don't even have one." "Antonio Moretti. Maybe you know the name." The silence was deafening. Even Brandon had grown up hearing whispers about the Moretti family, stories told in hushed tones, businesses that ran without interference, problems that simply disappeared. But Brandon was too far gone to back down with everyone filming. "Liar," he growled, voice betraying uncertainty. Carlos just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad always says family is sacred, and whoever messes with family, well, you'll find out." Carlos calmly picked up his phone, checked the recording was perfect, and put it away. His movements were precise, calculated, too mature for a child just assaulted. Brandon looked around, realizing he might have just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. In the 3 days following the incident, Brandon set about turning Carlos's school life into calculated hell. "Hey, Moretti," Brandon shouted down Lincoln High's hallway, pronouncing the surname with contempt. "Your Mafia daddy ain't protecting you here." Carlos continued walking calmly, ignoring the laughter. His backpack had disappeared for the 3rd time that week. What Brandon didn't realize was that Carlos photographed every incident, wrote down every date, cataloged every witness. At 12, he had learned from his father that documentation was power. "Thompson is testing boundaries," Carlos muttered on the phone during lunch. "Dad says small fish make noise before they get caught." Antonio Moretti's deep voice replied, "Son, sometimes you let people hang themselves with their own rope. Keep watching. Keep learning." Thursday afternoon, Brandon orchestrated an accident where Carlos was elbowed during basketball. Coach Williams, who knew Brandon's father, pretended not to see. Friday, Brandon made his fatal mistake. During recess, he and 4 friends surrounded Carlos near the bathrooms, away from cameras. "You know what, Moretti? I'm tired of your Mafia stories. My dad knows everyone important. If your family was dangerous, I'd have heard about it." Carlos looked him straight in the eye. Maybe you don't know the right people to hear the right stories." "Liar." Brandon clenched his fist. "I bet your father doesn't even exist." "Be careful what you say next," Carlos interrupted, voice low but laden with authority. "Or what? You'll call your imaginary daddy?" Carlos smiled and pulled out his phone. "Actually, good idea." The voice that answered was instantly recognizable, deep, controlled, with a subtle Italian accent the whole town knew from news reports about successful businessman Antonio Moretti. "Hi, Dad. I'm here with Brandon Hayes. Remember I told you about him?" Brandon and his friends recoiled. That voice. They knew it. Everyone knew it. "Oh yes, the Hayes boy. Son of the real estate developer. Interesting family. Give him the phone." Carlos handed the phone to Brandon, who was visibly pale. "He wants to talk to you." Brandon took it with trembling hands. Hello?" "Brandon Hayes." The voice wasn't threatening, it was worse. Polite, calm, almost friendly. "I hear you and my son have had misunderstandings. Sir, we were just... Let me explain something about family, kid. In my culture, family is sacred. When someone messes with my family, it becomes my personal problem." Brandon swallowed hard. His friends began backing away. "Now, I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding, but I want you to understand clearly. My son Carlos is polite, respectful, intelligent. He doesn't look for trouble, but I solve problems. It's been my specialty for many years." "Yes, sir. I understand." "Good. Give the phone back to Carlos." Brandon handed it back like it was burning. Carlos spoke briefly in Italian, then hung up. "He enjoyed talking to you," Carlos said politely. "Dad says it's important to know the families of my schoolmates." That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. Every shadow, every noise made his heart race. He had assaulted the son of the man everyone respected or feared too much to mention aloud. Saturday morning, Brandon's father received a call. "Hayes, Antonio Moretti here. He are our sons met at school. How about we talk in person? I have ideas about how our boys can get along better." The meeting was scheduled for Monday. Brandon spent the weekend wondering what that conversation could mean. Monday arrived like a sentence. Brandon had deep, dark circles, constantly looking over his shoulder. Carlos entered the courtyard with his usual calm. "Hayes," Principal Peterson's voice echoed. "My office now." Derek felt his legs buckle. In the office, Peterson closed the door. "Your father called. You and Carlos Moretti had disagreements. Want to explain?" "It was just a silly argument, sir." "An argument that resulted in you hitting him?" Peterson opened a folder. "We have witnesses, Brandon, and videos." Brandon realized the extent of the problem. Carlos had documented everything. Every push, every insult, every humiliation was recorded and organized like a professional dossier. "How did he get these messages?" Brandon whispered, horrified at screenshots of texts he'd sent friends mocking Carlos. "Apparently, some of your friends cooperated when they found out who Carlos's father was." Peterson closed the folder. 3-day suspension, and you'll apologize publicly. That afternoon, Richard Hayes arrived at school driving his BMW, face tense, hands trembling. Antonio Moretti was already waiting in the parking lot, leaning against an immaculate black Cadillac, calmly reading an Italian newspaper. "Mr. Hayes," Antonio greeted politely. "Thank you for coming." Richard tried to maintain composure. "Mr. Moretti, I'm sure we can resolve this like civilized men." "Of course. Let's talk in my office. It's more private." 20 minutes later, Richard emerged with deathly pallor and visibly trembling hands. He walked straight to Brandon, eyes avoiding contact. "We're moving," Richard whispered. "End of the month." "Dad, what happened? What did he say?" "Rich." Ard pulled Brandon into a corner. "He showed me photos, son. Photos of all our properties, our house, your class schedules. He knew where your mother shops, where I have lunch, even our dog's veterina." "But he didn't threaten you?" "He didn't need to. He just said family is important to him and he hoped I'd teach you the value of respecting other families." That evening, Carlos sat at dinner with his parents. His mother, Maria, served homemade lasagna while Antonio read emails. "Dad," Carlos said calmly, "Brandon Hayes is moving out at the end of the month." Antonio looked over his glasses. "How do you know?" "Because I've learned that when you plant the right seeds, you can predict exactly how they'll grow." Maria stopped serving, impressed. Antonio closed his tablet. "You're learning, Carlos. But remember, real power isn't making people fear you. It's making them respect you for who you are, not who your father is." "I know, Dad. That's why Brandon doesn't know the most important part yet." "What part?" Carlos smiled. Not a child's smile, but something calculated. "That I documented everything, not just to protect myself. I documented it to protect his next victims." In Carlos's folder was evidence of at least 8 other students Brandon had bullied over 2 years. Names, dates, witnesses, recorded conversations where Brandon bragged about his actions. "Tomorrow," Carlos continued, "I'm giving all this to the student council, not as Carlos Moretti, son of Antonio, but as Carlos Moretti, a student who refuses to let others go through what I did." Antonio leaned back, pride and concern in his eyes. His 12-year-old was demonstrating strategic intelligence and something rarer, a sense of justice beyond personal revenge. The next day, Brandon discovered his transfer was expedited. But worse, a presentation was being prepared by the student council on toxic behavior patterns at school, and his name appeared on almost every slide. Carlos had turned his victimization into a systematic campaign against bullying at Lincoln High. Every documented assault, every organized witness, and every piece of evidence cataloged with precision. Brandon realized he'd been completely outmaneuvered by a mind far more brilliant than his own, one that had turned suffering into strategy, humiliation into education, personal revenge into collective justice. The student council presentation Thursday morning attracted an unexpected audience. The auditorium was packed, students, parents, teachers, even local press discreetly invited. Carlos took the stage carrying a laptop and projector, wearing his impeccably ironed shirt, moving with quiet confidence learned from watching his father at business meetings. "My name is Carlos Moretti, and today I'm presenting a project on patterns of toxic behavior in educational environments." His voice was clear, professional. Brandon sat in the 3rd row, forced to attend as part of his suspension. His hands sweated as Carlos connected the projector. The first image made the auditorium whisper collectively, a detailed timeline of 2 years showing dozens of bullying incidents organized by date, aggressor, and victim. Over 24 months, I systematically documented 47 cases of intimidation, physical assault, and psychological humiliation at this school, Carlos began, all involving the same pattern: older, economically privileged students attacking younger children or those from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Brandon's blood ran cold when his name appeared highlighted in red in more than half the cases. Carlos clicked to the next slide. "This is Brandon Hayes physically assaulting 11-year-old Kevin Martinez in September 2023. The video played, showing Brandon pushing the smaller boy against lockers and stealing his lunch money. "This is Brandon Hayes publicly humiliating Lisa Chen for not speaking perfect English in October 2023. Another video showed Brandon crudely mimicking the girl's accent while others laughed, with each new patti. Ice of evidence, Brandon sank further into his chair. Around him, people looked his way with revulsion and disbelief. Here we have text messages where Brandon Hayes brags about his actions. Carlos projected WhatsApp screenshots. "Today I taught another brat not to cross my path. These guys need to learn who's boss." Brandon's mother covered her face. His father was visibly pale. "What I discovered," Carlos continued with prosecutorial coldness, "is that this behavior wasn't isolated. It was systematic, coordinated, and deliberately ignored by school administration." The next slide showed emails between Brandon and other students planning operations to humiliate specific targets. There was a list with victims' names and recommended methods for each. Coach Williams, Carlos looked directly at the PE teacher, you witnessed at least 12 physical assaults during your classes and chose not to intervene. I have witnesses and videos of each incident. Williams tried to protest, but the evidence was irrefutable. Carlos projected gym security camera footage clearly showing assaults, while Williams looked away. Rosa Santos, employee at Fat Tony's Burger, Carlos continued. You admitted on tape that you knew about Brandon's aggressive behavior, but chose not to report it because he was the son of an important family. The audio recording played. Rosa's voice. Look, I know the Hayes kid is trouble, but his dad has influence. Better not mess with that. Brandon tried to leave, but found it impossible. Antonio Moretti had arrived, strategically positioning himself near the door. Two men in discreet suits flanked the other exits. Finally, Carlos reached the climax. Last Monday's incident at Fat Tony's where Brandon Hayes physically assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. The original video played on the big screen. Every slap, every racist word, every moment of humiliation reproduced in high definition for everyone to see. Carlos paused at the exact moment Brandon hit him and turned to the audience. You know what my first reaction was? It wasn't anger. It was sadness. Sadness because I realized Brandon Hayes is a product of a system that teaches privileged children they can treat other human beings like objects. Brandon was visibly shaking, tears streaming down his face as hundreds watched. But this presentation isn't about Brandon Hayes, Carlos continued, voice soft but relentless. It's about all of us. About how a community can choose between protecting violent, privileged people or protecting defenseless children. Carlos projected the final slide, a photo of each of Brandon's 23 victims over 2 years with their names and ages. Children aged 10 to 14 who had suffered in silence while adults looked away. Brandon Hayes destroyed the self-esteem of 23 children. He stole lunch money from at least 15 students. He caused trauma some will carry forever. All of this was allowed because he had the right last name and parents. The silence was absolute. Brandon sobbed uncontrollably while his mother tried to comfort him. Richard stared at the floor, realizing their reputation was destroyed forever. My proposal, Carlos concluded, is simple. Zero tolerance for bullying regardless of last name. Mandatory training for staff on identifying and reporting aggression. And most importantly, a support program for victims silenced too long. The ovation was spontaneous and deafening. Students stood, parents applauded, teachers nodded. Carlos had turned his personal humiliation into an educational revolution. Brandon tried to hide behind his mother, but too late. Phones captured every second of his shame. In hours, he'd be known nationally not as a powerful bully, but as the coward who attacked children and cried when confronted with truth. As the Hayes family hurried out, Carlos stepped off stage to be greeted by dozens of students and parents. Antonio watched from the back, a discreet smile of pride on his face. Brandon had learned a lesson he'd carry forever. When you humiliate someone you consider weaker, there's always the possibility that person is much stronger than you imagined. Sometimes the consequences come packaged with a lesson in dignity that cuts deeper than any physical aggression. 3 months later, Lincoln High was unrecognizable. Carlos became student council president by unanimous vote, leading an anti-bullying program that attracted national attention. Brandon Hayes never recovered from the public humiliation. His family moved to another state, but the videos followed him. Universities rejected his applications when they discovered his history. Summer jobs evaporated when employers Googled his name. Carlos, however, received full scholarships from 5 prestigious universities. His Document to Protect campaign spread to 200 schools in 12 states. Dad always said the best revenge is success, Carlos explained to a CNN documentary about bullying. I didn't destroy Brandon Hayes. I just showed who he really was. Antonio watched proudly during his son's graduation. Carlos received 3 awards: academic merit, community leadership, and civil courage. Brandon watched the ceremony on YouTube from his new school where no one knew his past. Still, every time he saw a child being bullied, he remembered Carlos's words, "Family is sacred." The lesson was simple. Underestimating someone based on appearances is the first step to your own downfall. Sometimes heroes wear school uniforms and carry backpacks, proving that dignity has no age and justice waits for no one to grow up.